Hey there, in this one, I'm going to be showing you how to auto-generate Django models. That is models.py, so then you can run the migrations and all that. It's really cool, and it's a really easy way to connect to other databases, or if you're doing like web scraping or something like that, you want to do processing in Jupyter, it's another easy way to do those sorts of things as well. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, first and foremost, I'm just going to show you a demo. I want to show you what the result is going to look like. So if I run this kernel, I'm going to restart and run the entire thing, and I'll take you step by step really quickly as to what is going on here. Now, first and foremost, we initialize the Django ORM, and then we initialize the SQL Alchemy ORM, because we're going to be using SQLite as a middleman database that we will use InspectDB on, which I'll show you in a moment too. Then, of course, we grab the actual programming topics file itself, add it into a pandas data frame. We do some manipulation to that data frame, so we add a couple columns in here, and then we declare those column types, like the ones that we want them to be on our database. So yeah, of course, that's a little bit of manual work there. Then we actually store all of this data to that middleman database, right? So this is a SQLite database in this case, but it could be any database. Then we run the magic command. That is Python manage.py inspect database. We go to a specific database that we call light. Now, if you're familiar with Django, it's not really that big of a deal. You just come into the Django settings and you'll see that actual database in there, right? So we will definitely do this in this one too. So if I also take a look at what's being generated, we see that it actually generates this entire file here. Really cool. So I can just copy and paste that almost and then use it inside of my project. I do have to modify it just a little bit. So if we look at the actual models.py that I have, this is it. It's just slightly modified to what that InspectDB is doing because I actually want Django to manage it. If you don't want Django to manage it, you can just use based off of what they give you, what it's guessing that should be. But notice I didn't write any of this stuff. Django just spits it out to me, and I don't have to do this command in a Jupyter notebook at all. You could totally do it anywhere as long as you have access to manage.py and your Django project. That's how you do it. Really cool. So then after we make some changes, if we need to, we run make migrations and migrate like you might be familiar with. Then we grab that model itself inside of Django. That's this setup ORM thing that we did. And then we actually, convert that pandas data frame into a list of dictionaries. That's what this is doing here with the columns that we care about. And then from there, we just do a bulk create of all of that data and just delete all the old data that already exists in the database if there is something in there. And then we've got just a verified check that all of this stuff is working. So that's what we're going to do in this whole one. Now, if you're already pretty experienced with Django, you could just jump into the repo itself, which is right here. And if you go to that repo, you can just clone that repo and then you're good to go. For everyone else, let's go ahead and actually get started. All right, so to get started, what you'll do is download or clone the repo. That's, of course, this repo right here. That link will be in the description as well as the notebook itself. And then you're going to activate a virtual environment. You can use any virtual environment here, but you definitely want to use a virtual environment. Then you'll run the requirements and then run Jupyter Notebook. What that will do is open up this right here. There's a few things to note here. Number one, my Django project is called AutoGen, right? So not a big deal here. It's just a blank Django project. Number two, the actual data set that I'll end up using is inside of this folder called data, and the name is programming topics. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Next, the notebooks that we'll have in here, you'll see AutoGen final, but you'll be working off of AutoGen. I want you to go blank unless you know exactly what you're doing. But another thing that's in here is called Django Setup. So what this will do is allow our Django project to be used inside of a Jupyter notebook. You definitely don't have to have that run and work, but since I'm using that AutoGen file as my name project, that's what I'll be doing to initialize Django inside of Jupyter. It's just a really quick and easy way to do that. Okay, so now back inside of this Jupyter notebook, let's actually set up a few things. So the first one is from setup_Django. We're going to import the init Django. And we'll go ahead and initialize init Django. And again, my project name is just AutoGen, so I can pass that in here, or I could just leave it out because I did manual code it. Okay, so setup Django is not found. Oops, it's backwards. It should be Django Setup. I rename those things all the time. But anyway, so this now gives us access to the Django ORM. So that's the database, all the things that you might have in your project. you can use that inside of Jupyter now. It's just a really quick and easy way to do that that doesn't have a bunch of dependencies related to it. So the next thing is we actually want to connect to another ORM called SQL Alchemy. And this is often used in Flask projects. A lot of Flask projects use this, but I'm actually using it as a way for pandas to export this data to a SQL database. So Python pandas is what we'll end up using, not really SQL Alchemy. So I'll go ahead and do from SQL Alchemy. We're going to import the create engine method or function, and I'll just go ahead and say my engine, or let's call this our SQL engine, and I'm going to create that engine here. And now what I'm going to do is actually have a string to it. So it's going to be a SQLite engine. And normally you would just put 2 slashes and then the location of where it is. But if you want a relative import, you can do a slash here and then do light.SQLite3. So light being just an arbitrary name for the database itself. So this is really the database, and it's going to go on the root of our project, which we'll see in just a moment. Okay, so now that I've got that, there are my basic ORM setup. Not that big of a deal because we're not really going into advanced stuff here. But of course, if you wanted to, you definitely can. So the next thing is actually getting all of the data that we want to use here. So I'm going to do a couple more imports. First off, we'll import pathlib. And then I'm going to go ahead and import pandas as PD. And then after that, we will go ahead and set our root directory. So root dir. And this is equal to pathlib.path and .resolve. We should print out what that root directory is. And then our notebooks directory. This is something I like to do. It's not really necessary here, but I like having it. And it's just MBS. Notice pathlib is a bit different. This makes it really easy. This just converts it into a very readable format, both from a printing standpoint, but also just from a usability standpoint. And what we see here is the path to my root project, right? So not where the notebook is itself, but the root project, and that's what's going on here. Next, we've got our actual notebooks directory, which is that. The next one is our data directory, which of course is our root dir and inside of data. So that again is where the actual data set that we'll end up using is in here, right? So that's this right here. Cool. So now that I've got that, let's go ahead and actually grab that file. So I'm going to call this the topics CSV, and it's going to be equal to the data directory and then the file name itself, which in this case is just programming topics.csv. I scraped this from Stack Overflow a while back, so it's not necessarily up to date, but it is a lot of topics from Stack Overflow, which is kind of cool too. So with that, we now should actually have a bunch of things. So data dir, let's make sure that's there, and let's just go ahead and print out that it exists. So doing that, this is one of the coolest things about pathlib. I probably should talk about more about pathlib at some point, but there we go. So true, that file actually exists in there. So that means that I could feel pretty confident about creating a now pandas data frame. So pd.read and CSV, and then the topics CSV. Okay, so df.head. And there we go. So we now have what will be eventually a actual database. So I'm actually going to store this into a database in the near future. I can actually show you how simple it is to do that. And it's just df.toSQL. And then we give it a table name. So whatever table name we want to give it. In this case, I'll just call it topics. And then I'll also pass in if exists. And we'll just go ahead and replace the entire table. So it's going to delete everything that's in there and then just replace all of it. This is not the default. I just want to do this based on what it is that I'm trying to do. So the general idea is like, hey, I would have some sort of web scraping, and that's how I'd build this CSV file. And then I would have this replacement here. Next would be the actual connection. So the connection that I want to use, which is con. This is an argument that you can pass into that to SQL command, and we want to use our SQL Alchemy SQL engine. As of now, Pandas does not have a way to connect directly to a Django model, so that's kind of why this even exists. Okay, so if I actually run that, what I should actually have now is on my data and the root of my project, which is where manage.py is, and the root folder. I have light.sqlite 3. Okay, so that just created that database for me. But I don't want to actually stop at just that, right? I want to do a couple things to this data set so we can see, just generally speaking, what this will do inside of our Django project. So I'm going to go ahead and add another element here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a, let's say, percent of the total, right? So I've got a count here. These are big numbers. What I'm just going to do is basically sum up those numbers and add some sort of percent here. So it's really simple. It's just df count and then divide that by df count and then dot sum. So if you're not familiar with pandas at all, what this is doing is just creating a new column called percent. I don't actually have that column currently. And then what it does is it will take the current column value for any given row. So the row 1, it will take that value, and then it will divide by the entire column's total, and that will give us this percent, or roughly speaking. So if I do df.head towards the bottom of that, it will give me or show me that new column. Really simple, not too hard to do, but there we go. So we now have 3 new columns. So hopefully what you can imagine now is you might extrapolate this a lot and really build out a full-on data set, having many, many more models. So now comes the magic, I guess, of creating those models. So first off, we want to actually grab our SQL Alchemy types. So I'll do from SQL Alchemy.types. We're going to import the decimal type and a string. Okay. So the decimal type being the actual decimal, these percent here. If we don't actually declare these data types, there will be an inference for it. But that inference we don't want to do by default. We want to actually declare what these data types will be when we export it to SQL and into that database itself. Now, again, you don't absolutely have to do this for this whole thing to work, but it is a nice thing to do. So I'll call this SQL D types. And what we're going to do is actually grab the column. So this is going to be the field in Django. We're going to grab one of these columns and we're going to give it a explicit data type. So the tag, I'm going to say string. So what's going to map here, and I'll just go ahead and do this. This is going to map to models.char field, and then the decimal. And I know the spelling and the capitalization is all weird for you if you're not familiar with SQL Alchemy, but that's absolutely the type. So you can always Google SQL Alchemy types to see all of the different types they have. But this will turn it into a model.decimal field. And then there are other ones as well. I believe there's one called text, which will give you a text field. And if you have characters or some sort of text, it will actually default to text. So if I didn't actually declare a string here, it will be let's just say default D type. Often will go to models.text field. Okay, cool. So now we've got that. Let's go into the next one. And I'm going to leave count off of these data types. And then I'll go ahead and add percent to being the decimal data type. Now, this, of course, is the most important one that I have right here, is actually using that as a decimal data type. You can have it as a float data type. That is another data type that you can use. But typically when you're doing some sort of calculation, when it relates to accounting, for example, or arithmetic that requires you to be able to add things, and it works exactly like you do arithmetic by hand, adding percents together, we want to use a decimal field in that case. Not always, but definitely in this case. Okay, so now I've got this SQL data type here. And what I'm going to do is I actually want to pass in the argument of dtype in here. Okay, so let's run this cell and then run that. No errors at this point. So cool. So now I actually have that all set up. And you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, now what we need to do is jump into our Django settings. So into settings, I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. And we have this database already. What I want to do is add another database in here. It's really simple. We just copy that same thing. I'm just going to call this light, and I'm going to change the DB to light as well. Okay, so the base directory in this case, if we scroll to the top, we see that it is also using the pathlib version of this. So this base directory should actually go to the exact same place that we declared for our quote-unquote root directory. So those should be the exact same locations if you do it exactly as I have. Another way to know this with Django is wherever manage.py is, that is going to be your base directory for your Django project if you use Django-admin start project. Okay, cool. So now that we've got that, what I'm going to do is inside of here, I will just go ahead and write python manage.py InspectDB --database, and then that new database name, which is light. So if you do InspectDB without declaring the database and without having it in your settings file, right, and saved in your settings file as well, then it's going to go off of the default. So calling it light is literally going off of that key there, not this database. So if I called this ABC, I would need to call this ABC, right? Really simple, but nice and useful. Okay, so here is where all of the magic comes to head, right? We run that, and what do you know? Here it is. Here are my new models. Okay, so a couple things to note here. Number one, our decimal field actually worked. It's guessing how many decimal places, how many digits, and all that. How cool is that? In this case, the database that we're using handles decimal fields as float, which is fine. But notice that it is guessing what these things are. So you can now quickly just change them if you need to change them. Next thing is our count. Notice that it says a big integer field. That's awesome. So if we scroll up to our count, we see, hey, those are big integers. So it's nice that it automatically does the big integer field. The next is our tag. That's a character field or char field. That is, of course, because we used a string. Now, if I don't do that, so let's comment out that string and run this again. What it does is just a text field, right? So I told you that was a default that it will probably jump to, and that's what it did. So, of course, I wanted to just show you that you can really quickly change these things, and now you actually have some models that are ready to go. But I'm not quite done yet, right? So what I want to do is now come in to my Django project. Well, I can actually run it in here and run python manage.py, and we'll just go ahead and create app, and we'll call start app rather, and call this topics. Okay, so start app topics. Now that we've got that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of this, and we have to discuss all of these things too. So now into my topics app here, into models.py, I'll paste this in. And of course, there's a number of things that I don't need in here now. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. And I have these topics. Now, what this is typically for is not for auto-generating your fields, but what it's for is actually managing a pre-existing or a legacy database, a database that Django doesn't manage at this point. It does give you a bunch of tips on how you're going to want to use this inside of Django, right? So things like the primary key, you'll want to add that. But again, I'm not using a legacy database here. I just wanted to generate these models so that I can use them and do it really, really quickly instead of writing all this stuff out. Now, I realize this is a lot of work just to automatically write these things out. But the main thing about this is if it changes in the future, like if you wanted to scrape another field, you can add that field and then you'll have automatically some of the changes in here. And then if you use git or version control and you copy and paste this into a pre-existing model, version control is going to tell you which fields actually have changed, as well as make migrations and all those cool things. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just comment out index. I don't need that. And then I'm also going to comment out the metadata. Again, I do not need that. I don't want those things in there because I actually want Django to manage this. So with that, now I have this character field. I do need to add in a max length in here. And this is Django specific because, again, it's inferring, in this case, when you actually do that InspectDB, it's inferring that this is already existing in your default database, whatever that default database is. But in this case, it's not, right? So inside of our settings, we just are using that light database as just sort of a backup, not to be our primary database. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and add these apps in here. And the app itself was topics. Okay, so we'll save that. And let's go back into our Jupyter Notebook and run this. Typically, you would probably run this on the command line or something like that. But I'm going to do it here. So I'll make migrations, and then I'll migrate this out. And there we go. So it migrated everything on there. Okay, cool. So now with this, what I can do, I might have to restart my kernel inside of Django itself. But now what I can do is from topics.models, we're going to import the topic. Let's just double check to make sure that that's actually what we called the model itself. I actually called it topics on accident. I should have changed that to a singular topic. So each field or each entry in here was a singular topic. So now that I've made those changes, let's actually make migrations and migrate on one cell here. Okay, so, oh yeah, so this is actually a little bit of a problem. So I'll go ahead and interrupt this, and we'll actually, kernel interrupt. I will actually do this on the command line like I should have been. Okay, so let's go ahead and navigate into the dev folder and into our project. In my case, it's AutoGen DJ. And let me just source bin/activate and then run those two things. Oops, Python manage.py, make migrations, and yes. And then Python manage.py migrate. Okay, so I just renamed that model, no big deal. Okay, so with that, that also means that I'm going to want to refresh this kernel. So I'll restart and run all. All right, so if we scroll down, we should now, of course, have that topic model. We can actually import it. That's great. The next thing is I actually want to bring in that same data set into that topic model, right? So this is kind of bringing it full circle in a way. So what I'm going to do here is then I'll say my new data, and we're going to grab that data set. So it's going to be the data frame itself. And then to actually grab the columns that we want, well, we can do it a couple ways. So I'll go ahead and say columns equals to, well, we want the tag, we want the count, and we want the %. Okay, so I can actually pass in that list of columns in here like this. This will actually grab only those values. That's literally the rows and the columns themselves of that. It's basically just ignoring the index in this case, but if you added new columns in the future, you would want to do it this way. Okay, so now that I've got this, I've got that data, and then I would just run to dict and then records. And what that will do is give us all of that data as dictionary values. So there's a couple ways on how we can actually add this into our database. So the initial one, this is our Django managed database now. So the initial one would be to say new entries. So let me put this into an empty list, and then we'll just say for D in the data that we just grabbed. Okay, and then with this, I'll go ahead and say new obj equals to that data. So I'll go ahead and do topic and unpack that data into the topic model itself. Okay, and then I would just append to new entries. So new entries.append and our new obj. And then what you do here is topic.objects.bulk create, and you just pass in that list of not yet created instances. So this should actually bring it into our database. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. And data, oh yeah, this should be D, not data. Let's try that again. Okay, so this is actually creating all of those entries, or at least it should. So now I can just go ahead and do my query set of topic.objects.all and qs.count. And we got 13,212. And then if I do df.shape, that should give me the exact same number of rows. And in this case, it's 3 columns. But, you know, we definitely have that value now, which is great. But unfortunately, this will pretty much only be good in this case for this data set for the initial data, right? So in the future, what you'll probably want to do, we can copy this, is you would probably want to have the same IDs, or what we could do is actually iterate through all that and just do objects. So objects.get or create, and now it'd be, you know, something like tag equals to d.get tag. And then this would be our new object, and it's either going to create it or grab it. And then we would want to, you know, update all of the things otherwise than the tag itself. So then we would just come in here and iterate through that. So for key value pairs in d.items, this is going to take a lot longer. It's not going to be nearly as efficient. So it almost would be better just to delete all of that query set and then run the bulk entries in the future. In fact, that's what I would probably end up doing myself, but I'll just go ahead and show you how to do this. So if key is not equal to tag, or rather, let's just do if key is equal to tag, we'll just go ahead and continue it, continue the for loop in here, the sub for loop, and then otherwise we would set attribute of the new obj with that key and that value. And then after all that's done, we would just do new obj.save. Okay, so that would be one way to do it. This would be, appending or updating entries. Okay, and then you wouldn't actually do the bulk update at all. So that's one way to do it, one way to think about it. In fact, I'll just leave this in as markdown. So if you want to use it, you totally can, but I'm going to leave it in more as a note for future use. So what I would actually do is literally what we had before, so this right here, but instead I would just first do qs.delete, so deleting that original database, all of that data in that database. It's like a bulk delete, if you will, and then I would run through and just recreate them. That way I'm just having exactly what I want with regards to the data set itself, right? And we want to just set that equal to the df.shape of that first entry, and that's good. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is definitely a interesting way to go about doing things, but the bulk create is probably overall better. So maybe I can just put in a simple condition here and say if qs.count equals to 0, then I would just run the absolute new entries one, right? Or rather, let's just change that a little bit. If qs.count is not equal to 0, then we'll go ahead and do qs.delete. And of course, that query set is equal to topic.objects.all. That's a really simple way to do this from the get-go. But the reason I'm showing you this is not so much to really harp on Django itself and all the things that we want to do with Django, but rather to show you adding a new field in just a moment. Okay, cool. So now let's go ahead and actually add a new field to our data frame. So now we're like, okay, well, I got this percent. Well, maybe if I want a human readable percent. So percent and human, which really in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and multiply this by 100. Now we've got this new field in here, percent human, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add this in to my database. So now I'll go ahead and run python manage.py InspectDB of that database, of course. Again, we run that, and it's inferring percent human as a text field. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as that. It's really just to illustrate this example. Perhaps that's not the database, the type that we want, but I will put it into models.py now. Now, of course, this part could be automated. There is definitely a way to automate this, but I actually want to be the one that's inspecting this right here. But I just didn't have to type out all of this stuff, which is really nice. And of course, if I needed to change that data type, I could do it in here. But now that I've updated my models.py, the standard thing to do is make migrations and migrate. Sure enough, it's there. I did some tests off the video, so that's why I have a different migration number than you do. But if we go in here now, I can import that topics again. I might actually have to restart the entire kernel itself because of the changes that I made to Django. But I will say the new columns, I need to add in one more thing here and add in percent human. And now I should be able to rerun everything, or at least I think I should be able to rerun everything. So let's go ahead and restart the kernel, rerun it again, and see what ends up happening now. And hopefully what this will do is actually add in that percent human into our database, and it looks like it is. So if I do qs.first.percent human, that new field, it does give me that value, and it is in a string, right? So it's actually considered a text field itself. But again, if we now wanted to change that, we're like, oh, I want to change it actually to a string itself. So I'd come in here, oops, not percent, but rather let's add the new data type of percent underscore human. And now I'm just going to treat it as a character field. Again, I'm not sure if you would actually end up doing this, but perhaps it would actually work out for you. Now, again, it's the character field again. Now, if you're a Django developer, you're like, oh, well, I could just easily come into models and change it in here. You know, that's not that big of a deal. And adding in a max length value, because you definitely need that with a character field that's being managed by Django. So we add that max length value in here. you know, again, you don't actually have to use InspectDB for this in particular, but it is nice to know that this is another way to check and verify the way you're saving things is going to be pretty much the same throughout. And now let's go ahead and verify that I can actually bulk create those things. It looks like it worked again, and %human is still in there. So that's it. That is InspectDB. Now, when it comes to actually using a legacy database, just keep in mind that you have to use these other things. In other words, if I were to just put this SQL database and use it just as its own database separate from the Django database, you totally can do that. It's just a little bit more steps that you need to take to make sure that you can actually use that data in that database. In other words, we don't have to take this extra step of having another Django model and all that, because then what you could do is just use the, the predicted database model itself, and you can use a lot of things that come in with that. All right, so that's it for this one. Hopefully you got something out of this. To me, I was really excited when I actually figured out all of this stuff, because it does actually help a lot with data processing to know that, yeah, now I can just use a Jupyter notebook to do all of the data stuff I want to do, like inside of pandas and all that, cleaning it up, adding new fields, removing fields, doing all that stuff. And then I can just really just use this as one big notebook that I can use at any time. So of course, if I'm changing the fields, I need to do a few things manually, but overall, now at any point, if I run a new scraping event and I get new data, I can just restart and run all, and this will do all of that for me. And of course, this is going to delete all of the old data that was in there and then update it to a new one. So perhaps you would want another step to sort of back up the old database, which is not that big of a deal either. Or you could just back up the new version into, instead of SQL, you could use a text file or something like that. And then that way you actually still have the previous data, just not necessarily in the Django database. All right, so thanks so much for watching. Hopefully to see you in the next one.